What happens when a royal finally dares to shatter the silence? What happens when a voice, once restrained by centuries of tradition, breaks free and confirms the whispers that the world has been waiting to hear? That is exactly what has just happened. Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, has stepped into the spotlight with words that send shockwaves through the monarchy, through the palace walls, and through every corner of the world that has followed the story of Meghan Markle. And let me tell you, the picture Sophie paints is not a flattering one. It is dark. It is unsettling. It is a portrait of betrayal within the very heart of the royal household. From the very moment Meghan Markle entered the royal family, her arrival was seen as groundbreaking. The modern American actress, the outsider, the one who was meant to bring fresh air into the monarchy. But behind the polished photos, the staged smiles, and the magazine covers, something else was happening. Sophie's revelation confirms the rumors that had been swirling for years, that Meghan created a toxic environment inside the palace, that staff who had served loyally for decades suddenly broke down, that screaming matches filled the once silent corridors of Buckingham and Kensington. And the betrayal? It wasn't only Meghan against the staff. According to Sophie, it was the institution itself turning its back on the very people who had kept the monarchy running for generations. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Now, before you dismiss this as just another royal headline, ask yourself this: why now? Why would Sophie, someone who has stayed loyal to the mantra of silence for so long, finally decide to speak? And more importantly, what does it mean for Meghan, for Harry, and for the monarchy itself? These are the questions that we're going to unpack. But the truth is, Sophie's words are not just gossip. They are a testimony. And testimonies from royals don't come often. Picture this: the royal staff, the aides, the personal secretaries, the communications officers, the drivers, the cleaners, the unseen army that keeps the machine of monarchy moving smoothly. For centuries, these men and women have worked behind the scenes, loyal to a fault, invisible in the narrative. They do not seek the spotlight. Their silence is their duty. But suddenly, during Meghan's time in the palace, their silence began to crack. Leaks appeared. Rumors spread. Anonymous testimonies hinted at tears, at breakdowns, at walkouts. Newspapers reported stories of palace aides reduced to shaking hands and sleepless nights. Still, nothing was confirmed. Until now. Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, a woman known for her quiet strength and discretion, has finally said it plainly. Meghan bullied the palace staff. She created a toxic environment. The rumors, the speculation, the whispers in the shadows, all of them were true. This is not some random tabloid claim. This is a royal speaking. And not just any royal, but Sophie, who has lived her own life under scrutiny, who has served the monarchy without controversy, who has seen it all from the inside. When Sophie speaks, the world listens. But let's rewind for a moment. Because to truly understand the magnitude of Sophie's words, you need to understand the world she comes from. Sophie married Prince Edward, the Queen's youngest son, in 1999. From the beginning, she was seen as steady, reliable, and fiercely loyal to the Queen. Unlike Meghan, Sophie avoided scandal, avoided drama, and learned the royal way. Keep your head down, do your duty, and never let the press dictate your life. For over 2 decades, Sophie embodied the perfect balance of royal presence and private dignity, which is why her decision to finally break silence on Meghan is so extraordinary. Ask yourself this: what would push someone like Sophie to speak? What would push her past decades of discretion, past the unwritten rule of silence, into the storm of controversy? The answer lies in betrayal. Not betrayal of royals against royals, but betrayal of the staff, the very people who were meant to be protected. Sophie has revealed that Meghan's behavior broke these people down. And when the palace, instead of defending its staff, shielded Meghan, that betrayal cut deeper than anything else. Now, imagine the palace corridors during Meghan's time there. These are not loud places. They are places of order, of hierarchy, of whispers, not shouts. But Sophie's words confirm that Meghan brought chaos into those halls. Screaming matches. Tension so thick that aides could barely breathe. Resignations piling up in ways that had never been seen before. And this wasn't just difficult behavior. This was toxic. The kind of toxicity that leaves scars, that forces people to walk away from careers they'd built their lives upon. Sophie herself described it as an environment poisoned from within. But here's where it gets even more striking. For years, Meghan and Harry painted themselves as the victims. They claimed the institution failed them, that they were bullied, that they were unsupported. And yet, Sophie flips the narrative. She says it wasn't Meghan who was the victim, it was the staff. The ones who had no voice. The ones who couldn't run to Oprah. The ones who couldn't sign a Netflix deal. Those people were the true casualties of Meghan's reign in the palace. Do you see the irony? Meghan, who built her global brand on being silenced and oppressed, is now accused by Sophie of silencing and oppressing others. It's almost Shakespearean. A woman who claimed to have been victimized, weaponizing her position against those who had no power at all. And if Sophie's words are true, then the entire narrative Meghan has built begins to unravel. Now here's the twist. Sophie doesn't just confirm that Meghan bullied staff. She also says the staff felt betrayed by the palace itself. They believed that their loyalty, their service, their sacrifices were thrown aside to protect Meghan. Imagine that. Decades of service, erased in favor of shielding one woman who had barely entered the institution. This is the heart of the betrayal Sophie is talking about. The palace, in trying to protect Meghan's image, turned its back on the very people who had dedicated their lives to it. And here's where the emotional sting cuts deepest. These staff members were not just employees. They were the lifeblood of the monarchy. They were the ones who kept the machine running smoothly through crises, through deaths, through scandals. They were there for the Queen, for Charles, for Diana, for William and Kate. They had endured everything. And yet, they could not endure Meghan. So why now? Why would Sophie bring this up at this moment? Think about it. The monarchy is at a crossroads. The Queen is gone. Charles is king. William is stepping closer to his destiny. Harry and Meghan are still waging war from California. And in this critical moment, Sophie chooses to break silence. Her timing is not accidental. It is deliberate. It is a statement not just about the past, but about the future. And perhaps, more than anything else, Sophie's words are a warning. A warning to Meghan that history will remember. A warning to the monarchy that loyalty must never be discarded again. And a warning to the world that behind the glamour, behind the crowns and jewels, lies a story of betrayal so raw it threatens the very core of the monarchy's values. But this is just the beginning. Because Sophie's revelations are not just about screaming matches or resignations. They point to something deeper. Something that connects directly to the Queen herself, to the decisions she made in her final years, and to the way the monarchy will be remembered for generations. And that's where our story takes its next turn. Because if you thought Sophie's words about staff betrayal were shocking, wait until you hear what she says about the Queen's private struggle with this toxic environment. What happens when the Duchess, who has been known for decades as the quiet, steady hand of the monarchy, finally decides to speak out? What happens when the royal who once embodied discretion chooses to break with the age-old rule of silence? That's exactly what we're exploring now, as Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, finally confirms the rumors the palace hoped would stay hidden. And the first place we need to look is at her own words, her decision to speak at last, after years of silence, and the storm that decision has unleashed. Think about Sophie's reputation. For years, she was seen as one of the most loyal figures in the royal family. She wasn't the center of scandals, she didn't seek headlines, she wasn't courting Hollywood fame. She was, in many ways, the exact opposite of Meghan Markle. Sophie earned respect not by noise, but by restraint. So when she says something, when she chooses to add her voice, the world stops and listens. Why? Because it carries a weight that others lack. This is not someone who thrives on drama. This is someone who has spent her entire adult life avoiding it, which makes her breaking silence now all the more dramatic. And here's the hook. Sophie knew the stakes. Royals don't just talk. They measure every word. They understand the ripple effect of even the smallest comment. One misplaced sentence can fuel headlines across the world, can trigger diplomatic whispers, can shake public opinion. So imagine what it means when Sophie doesn't just drop a hint, but comes forward with confirmation. Meghan bullied staff. Meghan created a toxic environment. Sophie didn't say this in passing. She didn't leave it to implication. She said it directly. And in doing so, She shattered the carefully maintained narrative that Meghan and Harry had worked so hard to protect. But why now? Why after all this time? Why choose this moment, years after Meghan and Harry left the palace behind, to confirm what so many suspected? That's the burning question. And the answer lies in Sophie's deep understanding of the royal institution. Timing is everything. And Sophie's timing is not random. She knows the monarchy is fragile right now. She knows the staff who once endured Meghan's behavior are still carrying those scars. And she knows the world is questioning what the monarchy stands for in a modern age. Sophie's words, then, are not just a confession, they're a statement. Let's rewind for a second and look at the environment Sophie describes. Picture the palace. Long corridors, tradition etched into every corner, the silence of centuries pressing down on every step. This is not a place of chaos. This is not a place of raised voices. It is a place where protocol reigns, where whispers are more common than shouts, where composure is the rule of survival. And yet, according to Sophie, Meghan turned that atmosphere upside down. Screaming matches broke out. Staff members, hardened by decades of service, began to buckle. The dignity of the palace dissolved into fear and tension. Now imagine being Sophie, watching all of this unfold. Watching aides resign one after another. Watching people who had given their lives to service walk away in despair. And imagine the pressure of keeping quiet, of knowing the truth but being bound by the royal code. Sophie saw it. She lived it. And now, years later, she's speaking it. Ask yourself this. What could be so unbearable, so undeniable? That's Sophie, the most loyal, discreet, and cautious Duchess. Would finally break her silence? Could it be guilt? Could it be anger? Or could it be a desire to defend those who were silenced? Because Sophie's words don't just confirm Meghan's behavior. They defend the staff who were left voiceless. For once, their suffering is being acknowledged not by tabloids, not by anonymous leaks, but by a royal who stood alongside them. Let's talk about those staff for a moment. These are not just employees. These are men and women who often spend more time in service to the crown than with their own families. They know the royals lives better than anyone. They're loyal beyond reason. They never speak publicly, never betray the secrets of the household. And yet, during Meghan's time in the palace, they began to crack. There were stories of aides crying in bathrooms, of sleepless nights, of feeling worthless. And one by one, some of them walked out. That was unheard of. Staff didn't walk away from the Queen. They didn't walk away from William and Kate. But with Meghan, they did. Sophie confirms why. Now here's where the betrayal cuts deeper. Sophie says it wasn't just Meghan who hurt the staff. It was the palace itself. Because instead of protecting their own, instead of standing by the people who had served them for years, the palace shielded Meghan. They covered for her. They tried to silence the complaints. And in doing so, they betrayed the very people who kept the monarchy functioning. Can you imagine that? Decades of loyalty tossed aside to protect a new royal who had barely set foot inside the institution. That's the real sting of Sophie's words. The staff weren't just victims of Meghan's behavior. They were victims of a palace that chose to protect image over loyalty. And here's the irony. Meghan has built her entire narrative around being a victim. She told Oprah she was silenced. She told the world she was bullied. She claimed she was trapped in an institution that wouldn't let her speak. But Sophie flips that script. She says Meghan wasn't the victim. She was the bully. Meghan wasn't silenced. She was silencing others. The contradiction is staggering. And if Sophie is right, then Meghan's carefully crafted image begins to unravel before our very eyes. So let's pause here and ask, what does this mean for Meghan now? Because Sophie isn't some anonymous source. She isn't a disgruntled staffer. She's a duchess. She's family. And when family speaks, the impact is seismic. Sophie's words can't be dismissed as gossip. They can't be ignored as tabloid noise. They carry weight. They force people to reconsider the narrative. And for Meghan, that means facing a credibility crisis. But here's the twist you didn't see coming. Sophie's words aren't just about Meghan. They're about the Queen. They're about the monarchy itself. Because in revealing the toxic environment, Sophie also reveals the Queen's dilemma. What did the Queen know? What choices did she make? And how did those choices shape the institution's future? Sophie's confession opens the door to bigger questions, questions that cut right to the heart of the monarchy. And that's where the story takes its next turn. Because if Sophie's testimony about Meghan is shocking, what she suggests about the Queen's private struggle is even more explosive. It's a struggle that could change how we view the monarchy forever. Whispers. That's how it all began. Quiet voices in the palace corridors, subtle glances exchanged between staff members, carefully worded leaks to trusted journalists. For years, we heard them, didn't we? Rumors of screaming matches, stories of aides and tears, tales of staff walking out of their jobs. At first, they sounded too dramatic to be true. After all, this was the royal family, the institution famed for its discipline, its composure, its ability to withstand storms without ever cracking. But as the whispers grew louder, as the resignations piled up, as more and more anonymous sources began to paint the same picture, one thing became clear. Something was terribly wrong. And now Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, has confirmed it. The rumors weren't just idle gossip. They weren't fabrications by tabloids desperate for clicks. They were real. The palace really did descend into chaos during Meghan Markle's time there. The bullying claims weren't exaggerations. They were truth. The screaming wasn't imagined. It echoed through the halls. The tears weren't staged. They were shed by real people whose loyalty had been pushed beyond breaking point. So how did we get here? How did the fairy tale of Meghan Markle, the glamorous American actress, the new Duchess of Sussex, turn into a nightmare for those working behind the scenes? That's the question that Sophie's revelations finally answer. And it begins with those whispered rumors that everyone wanted to ignore. Let's paint the picture. It's 2018. Meghan and Harry have just married in a ceremony watched by millions around the world. The image is flawless, a Hollywood actress joining one of the oldest dynasties on Earth. A royal couple promising to modernize the monarchy, to inject it with energy, diversity, and compassion. The press is enchanted. The public is curious. The world is watching. But inside the palace, something entirely different is happening. Within weeks of Meghan's arrival, staff begin to notice cracks. Requests become demands. Meetings turn into confrontations. Meghan, who came with her own Hollywood expectations, doesn't adjust to the palace machine. She challenges it. And at first, perhaps, some saw this as refreshing. Maybe the palace needed a shake-up. But very quickly, the whispers turned darker. Staff weren't energized. They were terrified. Aides who once thrived under pressure were suddenly breaking down. And soon, rumors of Meghan's treatment of staff were seeping into the media. Do you remember the term the Sussex Survivors Club? That wasn't invented out of thin air. It came from staff themselves, a nickname whispered in private to describe those who had endured working with Meghan and Harry. That alone should tell you something. When your employees label themselves survivors, it's not a joke. It's a cry for help. And Sophie, with her decades of palace experience, saw it unfold firsthand. Now, think about how unusual this was. The royal household isn't new to difficult personalities. They've survived working with Princess Margaret, Prince Philip, even Diana, all of whom were demanding in their own ways. But never, not once, did we hear of mass resignations. Never did we hear of staff in tears on a regular basis. Never did insiders speak with such despair about their treatment. Which raises the question, what made Meghan different? Sophie's answer is chilling in its simplicity. Meghan bullied the staff. She created a toxic environment that crushed the people who had once been the backbone of the monarchy. The screaming matches weren't just dramatic spats. They were constant. The resignations weren't just career moves. They were escapes. And the staff, who had once believed their loyalty would always be respected, suddenly found themselves betrayed by the very institution they had served. But here's where it gets even more twisted. Meghan and Harry's narrative was the exact opposite. Publicly, they insisted they were the ones being mistreated. Meghan sat down with Oprah and told the world she was silenced, unsupported, even bullied by the institution itself. And many people believed her. After all, her story of being the outsider, the woman of color, the actress in a centuries-old system, it had all the elements of a powerful underdog tale. But Sophie flips it on its head. According to her, Meghan wasn't the oppressed, she was the oppressor. Meghan wasn't the silenced, she was the one silencing others. Can you see the contradiction? Now, here's where things get interesting. The press at the time did report on staff leaving. In fact, the turnover during Meghan and Harry's time was unusually high. Headlines spoke of Hurricane Meghan, of aides unable to cope, of private secretaries resigning after only months in the job. And yet, the palace refused to confirm any of it. They protected Meghan. They tried to control the narrative. But behind closed doors, Sophie now tells us those rumors. Let's talk about those resignations. Do you remember Melissa Toabdi, Meghan's personal assistant who quit just 6 months into the job? Reports at the time suggested she left in tears after clashes with Meghan. Now imagine being in Sophie's position, watching trusted staff members walk away after decades of loyalty, watching them break under pressure, and being told to remain silent. How long could anyone stay quiet in that situation? And then there were the screaming matches. Insiders once claimed Meghan shouted at aides until they trembled. They described being berated for minor mistakes, of being treated with disdain. Sophie confirms this, that the shouting wasn't rare, it was routine. And in a palace where composure and restraint are everything, that kind of behavior was more than shocking. It was destructive. Let's ask the audience directly. Can you imagine working in an environment where you never knew if you'd be screamed at? Where your every action could be torn apart by someone who wielded the power of royal status. And worse, where you knew that even if you complained, no one would protect you because the palace had chosen to shield the very person causing the harm? That's the betrayal Sophie is talking about. And it gets even darker, because Sophie hints that the staff felt not only bullied, but abandoned. They had trusted the palace to stand by them. They had given their lives in service, often with little reward beyond loyalty. And yet, when they needed the palace most, when they needed protection from Meghan's behavior, the institution turned its back on them. Can you feel the weight of that betrayal? Now, why does this matter today? Because it exposes the deep cracks in the monarchy. The Queen always insisted that the monarchy was about duty, service, and loyalty. But here we see the opposite. Here we see staff being sacrificed to protect image. And Sophie, by breaking her silence, has forced the world to confront this hypocrisy. But this is just the start. Because if the rumors were true, if the resignations were real, if the toxic environment was as bad as Sophie says, then the next question is unavoidable. How far did it go? Who else knew? And what decisions were made at the very top to cover it all up? That's where the story moves next. Because as shocking as Sophie's confirmation of the rumors may be, it's nothing compared to what came after. The first resignation that shook the palace to its core. And once that resignation happened, the whispers were no longer whispers. They were alarms ringing through Buckingham Palace itself. Screaming. That's the word that keeps coming up. Not frustration, not stern words, not raised voices in moments of stress, full-blown screaming. Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, has confirmed that what was once whispered as rumor was in fact reality. Meghan Markle wasn't simply difficult or demanding. According to Sophie, she screamed at palace staff in ways that rattled the very foundation of the royal household. Imagine the setting. These are not Hollywood film sets or chaotic boardrooms. These are the silent, polished, hallowed halls of Kensington Palace and Buckingham Palace, where tradition weighs heavier than air, where composure is the law of survival, and where even the sound of hurried footsteps can turn heads. And yet, into that environment came the sound of Meghan's fury. Sophie recalls the echoes of shouting, moments when seasoned staffers froze, moments when the calm dignity of the palace dissolved into the chaos of one woman's temper. Ask yourself, can you picture it? A royal aide, trained for years to keep a poker face even in the most stressful situations, standing still, hands shaking, trying to hold back tears as a duchess rages at them for something as trivial as a scheduling mix-up or a poorly worded press release. Sophie tells us that these weren't one-off incidents. They weren't isolated bursts of anger. They became a pattern, a rhythm of fear that marked Meghan's time inside the palace. Now, let's step back for a moment. Because to understand just how shocking this is, you have to understand what palace staff normally endure. These are people who worked for the Queen herself. Staff who lived through decades of storms, scandals, deaths, divorces. They endured Princess Margaret's eccentricities, Prince Philip's sharp tongue, Charles and Diana's collapsing marriage, Andrew's disgrace. They endured it all, without breaking. And yet, with Meghan, they cracked. Why? Sophie says the difference was the intensity. Meghan's fury wasn't delivered in sly remarks or sharp wit. It was explosive, loud, unrelenting. It left no room for dignity, no room for recovery. Staff weren't just shaken in the moment. They carried the weight of it home with them. They began dreading work. They began counting the days until they could escape. And some of them did. Do you remember the reports of staff nicknaming Meghan Hurricane Meghan? Or the whispers that aides had formed what they jokingly called the Sussex Survivors Club? Sophie's testimony now makes those nicknames chillingly real. Hurricanes don't pass quietly. They destroy. And survivors don't laugh at their ordeal. They cling to one another in relief that they made it out alive. One staffer's story, which leaked to the press at the time, described Meghan berating an aide so viciously that the aide broke down in tears right in front of her. Another described a pattern of impossible demands, emails at 5 a.m. Constant criticism, no praise, no reprieve. Sophie confirms these were not exaggerations. She saw the toll. She saw the tears. And she saw the resignations that followed. Now, here's where the irony bites. Meghan herself claimed she was silenced by the institution. She told Oprah she lost her voice, that she wasn't allowed to speak. But Sophie says Meghan's voice was louder than anyone's. Loud enough to fill palace corridors. Loud enough to send staff fleeing. Loud enough to leave scars that still linger. How's that for contradiction? But maybe you're wondering, could this all be cultural? Meghan came from Hollywood, where directness and intensity are the norm. Maybe she simply clashed with the stiff, restrained culture of the palace. Sophie considered this too. But her conclusion was simple. There's a difference between cultural clashes and cruelty. You can be assertive without being abusive. You can be bold without belittling. What Sophie saw, and what she now confirms, was not culture shock. It was bullying. Think about the effect this had on the palace's atmosphere. Staff who once worked in a calm, orderly environment were now walking on eggshells. They second-guessed every email, every task, every word. Tension seeped into every corner. The palace, once a sanctuary of structure, became a minefield. And the staff, once proud of their service, began to feel trapped. Sophie says the fear was palpable. You could feel it in the air. And here's the part that twists the knife. The screaming didn't just scare the staff. It humiliated them. Imagine being yelled at by a duchess in front of your colleagues, your superiors, maybe even your juniors. Imagine the shame of standing there, powerless, while the person you serve tears you down. That humiliation doesn't fade. It lingers. And Sophie, with her quiet dignity, couldn't stand watching it anymore. Now, ask yourself this. How many times can staff endure this before they break? Once? Twice? 10 times? Sophie says that by the time the first major resignation came, the environment was so toxic it was almost unbearable. The screaming had become the soundtrack of their days. And for one senior aide, it was too much. They packed their bags. They walked away. And in doing so, they set off alarm bells that even the palace could no longer ignore. That resignation, the first big one, wasn't just another staff change. It was a signal flare. It told the palace that something was seriously wrong. But instead of confronting the issue, instead of protecting their staff, the institution doubled down. They shielded Meghan. They silenced the complaints. They chose image over loyalty. And in doing so, they betrayed the very people who had kept the monarchy alive for generations. And that betrayal? That's where Sophie's revelations cut deepest. Because it wasn't just Meghan's screaming that broke people. It was the knowledge that the palace would let it happen. That their loyalty meant nothing. That the institution they had served with devotion would throw them under the bus to protect a newcomer. But what happened after that first resignation? Did the palace learn its lesson? Did Meghan change her ways? Or did things spiral even further out of control? That's where we go next. Because Sophie's account doesn't stop at the screaming. It doesn't stop at the tears. The first resignation was only the beginning. And what followed would shake the palace even more. Resignation. It's a word that carries weight inside the royal household. Staff don't just resign. They don't walk away from the palace lightly, not after years or even decades of service. For generations, working for the crown has been a badge of honor, something people dedicate their lives to. Some start in their 20s and remain until retirement, their loyalty etched into the very fabric of the monarchy. But during Meghan Markle's time in the palace, something unprecedented happened. People started leaving. Not quietly, not because they had reached the end of their careers, but abruptly, in tears, and often under circumstances that shocked even seasoned insiders. Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, now confirms what the world suspected. Those resignations weren't accidents. They weren't coincidences. They were escape routes. Let's step back and picture this for a moment. The royal household is a machine built on loyalty. Staff rarely leave in the middle of major assignments, especially not when serving senior royals. Continuity and stability are prized above all else. A resignation is not only disruptive, it's humiliating for the institution. It suggests disorder, it suggests something is wrong behind the scenes. And yet, during Meghan's early years as Duchess of Sussex, resignations became the new normal. The first big one shook the palace to its core. Meghan's personal assistant, Melissa Toabdi, quit after just 6 months on the job. 6 months. For context, most royal assistants serve for years, sometimes decades. Melissa had been handpicked, experienced, and trusted. She had even helped coordinate Meghan and Harry's royal wedding, a monumental task that put her at the heart of history. And yet, after just half a year, she was gone. The press at the time reported that she had been reduced to tears by Meghan's demands. Now Sophie confirms that was exactly what happened. Imagine the atmosphere when Melissa resigned. Shock rippled through the staff. Whispers spread like wildfire. How could someone with that level of skill, someone who had managed one of the most high-profile weddings in modern history, decide to walk away so suddenly? The answer, according to Sophie, was simple. The toxicity had become unbearable. But Melissa wasn't alone. 1 resignation was unusual. 2 was alarming. 3 was catastrophic. And that's exactly what happened. Not long after Melissa's departure, Meghan's deputy private secretary, Samantha Cohen, also resigned. Known as Samantha the Panther for her sharp instincts and competence, Cohen was no lightweight. She had served the Queen herself for over 17 years. She knew the system, she knew the protocols, she knew how to survive in the palace. Yet even she couldn't withstand the pressure of working with Meghan and Harry. Sophie, reflecting on this, makes it clear, if someone as seasoned as Samantha Cohen chose to leave, the situation must have been beyond repair. Let's pause here and ask the question directly. What does it say when palace veterans, people who had endured the toughest storms in royal history, couldn't handle Meghan? What does it say when loyalty that had lasted decades collapses within months of her arrival? Sophie's words confirm the obvious. It wasn't incompetence. It wasn't coincidence. It was Meghan. Now think about what that meant for the other staff. Every resignation was like a signal flare. Every departure told those who remained that they were trapped in an impossible situation. Morale began to crumble. Confidence in the palace's ability to protect its own eroded. Aides whispered about feeling abandoned, discarded, betrayed. Sophie says the atmosphere was unlike anything she'd seen before, a mixture of fear and despair, with each resignation deepening the wound. And here's the cruel irony. The palace didn't step in to fix it. They didn't protect their staff. They didn't discipline Meghan. Instead, they tightened the circle of silence. Complaints were brushed aside. Departures were spun as personal choices or career changes. The public was told nothing. But inside the palace, everyone knew the truth. And Sophie, watching it all unfold, saw a betrayal that cut to the very core of what the monarchy was supposed to stand for: loyalty and duty. One of the most heartbreaking details Sophie shares is how staff who left felt they had failed. Imagine that, being bullied, belittled, and screamed at, and yet walking away feeling guilty. That's how deep the palace culture of service ran. These people weren't just leaving a job. They were leaving a calling, a commitment they had promised to uphold for life. Sophie says she remembers conversations where aides admitted they felt ashamed to leave, even though they couldn't endure another day. That's not just a resignation, that's devastation. And here's something even more telling. Meghan and Harry never publicly acknowledged the exodus of staff. Not once did they express regret or sorrow over the people who walked away. Instead, they painted themselves as the only victims, the only ones suffering under the weight of the institution. Can you see the contradiction? Staff were resigning in tears, careers were being destroyed, loyalty was being shattered. And yet Meghan insisted she was the one silenced. She was the one oppressed. Sophie, with her calm clarity, exposes this irony for what it is, a false narrative. But if you think the resignations ended there, think again. Because Melissa and Samantha weren't the only ones. Over time, more staff followed. Press reports at the time spoke of Meghan and Harry going through aides like revolving doors. The once stable royal household had become a place of constant turnover. And every time another aide left, the whispers grew louder. Was Meghan impossible to work with? Was Harry complicit? Was the palace too weak to act? Sophie's confirmation of the bullying allegations now answers those questions with chilling certainty. So let's put this into perspective. These resignations weren't just HR problems. They were cracks in the monarchy's foundation. The palace relies on staff to keep the institution functioning. Without them, chaos reigns. Meghan's behavior, confirmed by Sophie, didn't just hurt individuals. It threatened the very stability of the royal family itself. That's the magnitude of this betrayal. But here's the twist, and it's one that Sophie alludes to with quiet gravity. The resignations weren't just about Meghan. They were also about the palace's response. By choosing to protect Meghan at the expense of their staff, the palace sent a dangerous message. Loyalty no longer mattered. Service no longer mattered. The monarchy was willing to sacrifice its own for the sake of one woman's image. And that, in Sophie's view, was the ultimate betrayal. Now, ask yourself this. What happens when an institution built on loyalty betrays the very people who hold it up? What happens when the staff who once carried the monarchy with dignity realize they are expendable? That's the question Sophie leaves us with as we turn the page. Because the resignations were only the beginning. What came next was even darker. The palace itself began to rot from within. The environment wasn't just difficult, it became toxic. And Sophie's words make it clear, the toxicity wasn't just a rumor. It was real. And that's where our story goes next. Because if the resignations shocked the monarchy, the toxic environment that followed threatened to tear it apart completely. Toxic. That's the word Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, uses. Not difficult. Not challenging. Not even stressful. Toxic. And when Sophie chooses her words, she chooses them carefully. This wasn't a slip of the tongue, it wasn't exaggeration, it was a deliberate indictment. Meghan Markle, Sophie reveals, didn't just cause tension inside the palace. She poisoned the atmosphere, turning what was once a place of discipline, dignity, and quiet service into a battlefield of fear, hostility, and betrayal. Think about that for a moment. The royal household is supposed to be the epitome of professionalism. Staff who work there endure endless hours, constant pressure, and unrelenting scrutiny. And yet, they do it with pride because they believe they are part of something greater. They aren't just employees, they are guardians of the crown's legacy. For centuries, palace life has been demanding, but never unbearable. Until Meghan arrived. Sophie's account paints a chilling picture of what those years were like. Aides crying in bathrooms, whispers of humiliation, a constant fog of dread that hung over the staff like a storm cloud. So what exactly does toxic mean in this context? Sophie says it wasn't just the shouting, though that alone was enough to rattle the palace's foundations. It was the way staff felt stripped of dignity. They no longer felt respected. They no longer felt protected. They no longer felt proud of the work they did. Instead, they felt used, belittled, discarded. Every day became a test of survival. Every task a potential spark for another confrontation. And here's where the betrayal deepens. Staff members confided to Sophie, sometimes in whispers, sometimes in broken voices, that they felt completely abandoned. Their loyalty had been met not with gratitude, but with silence. The palace, desperate to protect Meghan's image as a glamorous new duchess, refused to acknowledge their suffering. Complaints were brushed aside. Formal HR processes were smothered. Instead of accountability, there was cover-up. Instead of support, there was silence. And so the staff carried the weight alone. Ask yourself this. How does it feel to dedicate your life to serving the monarchy? only to realize that when you're in pain, no one will defend you? Imagine being told to endure the screaming, to ignore the humiliation, to swallow the tears, all in the name of protecting someone who had only just arrived. That's what Sophie says happened. That's what toxic meant inside those walls. Now, let's contrast this with the palace environment before Meghan. Sophie recalls years when the staff, though pushed hard, still felt pride in their work. The Queen's aides, for example, often described her as demanding but fair, precise but kind. Even Diana, with her fiery personality, inspired loyalty rather than fear. Royals before Meghan may have been difficult, but they never left staff in pieces. Meghan was different. Sophie's testimony confirms it. She didn't just push people, she broke them. But let's be clear, Sophie doesn't describe Meghan as simply rebellious. She describes her as toxic. This wasn't a case of someone pushing boundaries for noble reasons. It was a case of someone using their position to dominate, to control, to belittle. Meghan's clash with the monarchy wasn't about modernizing it. It was about weaponizing it for her own advantage. And the cost of that weaponization? Staff morale, palace stability, and the Queen's peace of mind. Here's where the contradiction cuts deep. Meghan positioned herself publicly as a reformer. She claimed she wanted to make the monarchy more compassionate, more inclusive, more modern. She gave interviews painting herself as a victim of an outdated system. But Sophie's words turned that narrative upside down. Meghan didn't modernize the monarchy. She destabilized it. She didn't bring compassion. She brought cruelty. She didn't expand its inclusivity. She shrank its unity. And if Sophie is right, then Meghan's public image is nothing more than a mask, one designed to hide the very toxicity she unleashed inside. Think about the irony for a moment. Meghan and Harry launched the Heads Together campaign with William and Kate, speaking passionately about mental health, about protecting people from workplace bullying, about ending stigma. Yet Sophie says Meghan was driving staff to mental breakdowns, reducing seasoned aides to tears, creating exactly the kind of toxic environment she claimed to fight against. Can you see the hypocrisy? Public champion of kindness, private architect of cruelty. And let's not forget Harry. Sophie doesn't paint him as an innocent bystander. She suggests he enabled Meghan's behavior. Staff who once described Harry as approachable, even fun, now saw him become defensive, combative, distant. He stood by Meghan, always against the institution, never with it. Instead of calming the storm, he fueled it. Instead of protecting the staff, he ignored their suffering. And so the battle lines were drawn. Meghan and Harry on one side, the monarchy and its traditions on the other. But here's the chilling part. Sophie says this wasn't just a clash of personalities. It was a betrayal of duty. Because every royal, from the Queen down to the youngest grandchild, is taught one lesson: service above self. That's the foundation of monarchy. And yet Meghan flipped that lesson on its head. For her, it was self above service, her desires above tradition, her comfort above loyalty. And that, Sophie says, is the greatest sin a royal can commit. Now, imagine the effect this had on the monarchy's image. On the surface, the world saw glamour, photo shoots, speeches, tours. But behind the curtain, Sophie says, the palace was rotting. Staff whispered of fear. Aides quietly resigned. The Queen herself faced impossible decisions. Meghan's war with the monarchy wasn't just personal. It threatened the stability of the entire institution. And here's where Sophie delivers the cruelest twist of all. Meghan once claimed she left the royal family because she couldn't survive its toxicity. But Sophie reveals it was the other way around. The monarchy struggled to survive hers. The institution that had withstood centuries of wars, scandals, abdications, divorces, and disasters was almost brought to its knees by one woman's behavior. If that is an irony, what is? But Sophie's testimony leaves us with an even darker question. If Meghan was clashing this violently with the monarchy, how did the Queen respond? How did the woman who embodied the institution for 70 years deal with this toxic storm inside her own household? Did she protect Meghan? Did she protect the staff? Or did she, too, betray the very people who had given her their lives? Because Sophie hints that the Queen's hands were tied. That the palace, terrified of bad press and accusations of racism or cruelty, chose to protect Meghan no matter the cost. And if that's true, then the monarchy's betrayal wasn't just of staff. It was of its own principles. Which brings us to the next chapter in this story. Because if Meghan versus the monarchy was destructive, it was the silent witnesses, the other royals, the other staff, the other insiders, who saw everything and said nothing until now. And their silence, Sophie suggests, speaks louder than words. Silence. It's often described as golden inside the palace. Royals are trained to say nothing, to keep their heads down, to let the press storm rage without ever breaking composure. But sometimes silence isn't golden. Sometimes it's deafening. Sometimes it's the sound of complicity. And that, Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, makes clear, is exactly what happened during Meghan Markle's reign of chaos inside the royal family. She wasn't the only one who saw it. She wasn't the only one who heard the screaming, who watched the tears, who noticed the resignations piling up like dominoes. Others knew. Others saw. Other royals, from junior to senior, were silent witnesses to the destruction. They said nothing publicly. They said nothing officially. But behind closed doors, they whispered. They worried. They confided in Sophie. And their silence, Sophie reveals, has haunted the palace ever since. Let's picture the scene. You're walking the quiet corridors of Buckingham Palace or Kensington Palace. You pass an aide who once carried themselves with pride, shoulders straight, eyes sharp. Now their eyes are downcast, their face pale, their steps hesitant. They avoid contact. They whisper in hushed tones to colleagues. They look broken. You don't need to ask why. You already know. Meghan has struck again. You don't need to be in the room to know it happened. The walls carry the echoes. The staff carry the scars. And the royals, Sophie included, walk by, aware, but bound to silence. Ask yourself this. How many royals saw the cracks and chose to say nothing? How many witnessed staff breaking down but feared the consequences of speaking out? Sophie admits she did. For years, she kept quiet. She stayed loyal to the code of silence. And in doing so, she became a silent witness. It wasn't until now, until she could no longer bear the weight of it, that she decided to break that silence. But others? They remain quiet to this day. Consider Prince Edward, Sophie's husband. He may not be as outspoken as his siblings, but he is observant. Sophie says Edward knew something was wrong. He saw Sophie's concern. He heard whispers from aides. He, too, noticed the pattern of resignations. But Edward chose caution. Like Sophie, he stayed silent. And in that silence, the suffering continued. What about Princess Anne, the Queen's only daughter? And is famously blunt, famously no-nonsense. If anyone could have cut through the noise, it was her. Sophie hints that Anne, too, saw what was happening, and had long been skeptical of Meghan. She warned Harry early on, according to some reports, that Meghan wasn't a good fit for the institution. And when the staff turmoil erupted, Anne surely noticed. But even Anne, sharp, fierce, and unafraid, chose silence. Why? Because speaking out would have meant open war with Meghan and Harry. And no one was ready to ignite that firestorm. Even William and Kate couldn't ignore it. Staff who left Meghan and Harry's household often found themselves compared to the Cambridge's team. William and Kate's aides rarely left, rarely complained. They described a workplace of professionalism, even kindness. The contrast was glaring. William, in particular, must have noticed the difference. Yet he, too, said nothing publicly. Because to acknowledge Meghan's toxicity would be to admit a crisis within the monarchy itself. And that was unthinkable. So they all became silent witnesses. Royals who knew the truth but chose not to speak it. Staff who endured in silence, knowing that complaining would only cost them their jobs. Even the Queen, Sophie suggests, saw more than she let on. Silent witnesses, every one of them. And their silence created a shield for Meghan. A shield that allowed her to continue unchecked. But here's where the guilt sets in. Sophie admits that silence is not neutral. Silence is complicity. By staying quiet, by choosing the institution's rules over the staff's suffering, she and the others enabled Meghan. They let the toxic environment fester. They let loyal staff break under the pressure. And now, years later, Sophie is haunted by the knowledge that she didn't do more, that she didn't speak sooner, that she didn't shatter the silence when it mattered most. Let's pause here and ask, how often in life do we see wrongs unfolding and choose silence because it's easier, because it's safer? The palace may seem like another world, but in this moment, it's not. It's the same human failing we all share. Choosing silence over confrontation, even when we know silence makes us part of the problem. Sophie, with her quiet honesty, holds up a mirror to herself and to the entire monarchy. But silence doesn't last forever. Whispers eventually become voices. And according to Sophie, even within the royal family, those whispers began to grow louder. Royals talked privately about Meghan. They worried about staff. They wondered how long it could go on. And some, like Sophie, began to prepare themselves for the moment when silence would no longer be an option. Here's where the story takes its twist. Sophie hints that Meghan wasn't entirely alone in her behavior. That maybe, just maybe, she had encouragement. That perhaps Harry himself wasn't just a passive enabler, but an active participant in creating the toxic environment. Silent witnesses began to wonder. Was Meghan the sole problem, or was she part of something bigger? Was this a joint rebellion against the monarchy itself, with the staff caught in the crossfire? Think about that. If Meghan alone had been the problem, perhaps it could have been contained. But if Meghan and Harry together were clashing with the institution, then silence wasn't just protecting Meghan. It was protecting the entire narrative of the Sussexes as victims. It was protecting Harry, the Queen's beloved grandson. And so silence continued, not because the royals didn't care, but because the truth was too explosive to handle. Now imagine being Sophie in this moment, watching the staff crumble, knowing the whispers are true, knowing the silence is protecting the wrong people, and yet feeling powerless to break the code. Imagine the guilt. Imagine the frustration. That's why, years later, she finally broke. Because silence had become betrayal. Betrayal not only of the staff, but of the values the monarchy was supposed to uphold. But here's the cliffhanger. Sophie says that silence didn't just protect Meghan. It betrayed the staff. And worse, it betrayed the monarchy itself. Because when those who see the truth stay quiet, the truth doesn't disappear. It festers. It grows. And eventually, it explodes. And that explosion came with what Sophie calls the staff betrayal. A moment when the aides themselves realized they hadn't just been bullied by Meghan. They had been abandoned by the palace. Betrayal. That's the word Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, doesn't hesitate to use when she describes what really happened behind the walls of Buckingham and Kensington Palace. And make no mistake, this wasn't betrayal in whispers or subtle glances. This was betrayal that cut so deep it broke the very bond that had kept the monarchy alive for centuries, the bond between the crown and its staff. For generations, royal aides accepted a life of sacrifice. They weren't there for glory. They weren't there for riches. Most of them lived modestly, worked tirelessly, and endured unimaginable pressure. Why? Because they believed in loyalty. They believed that serving the monarchy was serving history itself. They believed that no matter how heavy the workload, no matter how great the stress, the institution would stand by them. It was a covenant of trust. But according to Sophie, Meghan's arrival shattered that covenant, and the palace itself delivered the final blow by choosing to protect Meghan instead of its own people. Let's walk into this moment. Staff are already exhausted. They've endured the screaming. They've endured the humiliation. They've endured watching colleagues resign, broken and devastated. But they stay, because that's what loyalty looks like. They believe that eventually the palace will step in, that the crown they've served will protect them. And then comes the revelation: the palace won't. Complaints are brushed aside. HR reports disappear into thin air. Whispers to senior figures are met with silence. The staff begin to realize the truth. The institution they've given their lives to has abandoned them. Can you imagine the pain of that realization? To give your best years, your energy, your loyalty, only to find that when you're in need, you're disposable? Sophie says this was the deepest cut of all. Meghan's bullying may have broken their spirits, but the palace's betrayal broke their faith. And let's not underestimate the scale of it. Sophie recalls that this wasn't just one or two isolated staff members feeling overlooked. It was widespread. Aides whispered to one another that they'd been hung out to dry. Secret conversations in corridors turned into shared confessions of despair. Loyal servants who had once prided themselves on keeping secrets began to leak their pain to the press. Not because they wanted attention, but because they had nowhere else to turn. That's how the world first learned about the toxic environment. It wasn't gossip. It was desperation. Now here's the cruel irony. While staff were collapsing inside, Meghan and Harry were standing on global stages, preaching about compassion, mental health, and kindness. They were delivering speeches about creating safe environments, while, according to Sophie, presiding over one of the most unsafe environments the palace had ever known. And the palace, desperate to avoid scandal, allowed it, covered it, protected it. Think about the contradiction. Imagine being one of those aides, wiping away tears after another screaming match, only to turn on the news and watch Meghan being hailed as a humanitarian icon. Imagine the fury of seeing the palace PR machine spinning her as a victim while you, the true victim, were silenced. That's what Sophie describes: betrayal layered upon betrayal. But why did the palace protect Meghan? Sophie offers a chilling explanation: fear. The monarchy feared being accused of racism, of cruelty, of being hostile to an outsider. They feared that disciplining Meghan would trigger an even greater media storm. So they sacrificed the staff instead. They sacrificed the people who had kept the monarchy afloat for generations in order to protect the image of someone who had only just arrived. And let's pause to consider this. When the crown abandons its staff, it abandons itself. Because the monarchy doesn't run on crowns and titles alone. It runs on the people who work 16-hour days behind the scenes, who keep the machine turning. Without them, the entire institution collapses. By betraying them, the palace risked not only morale but its own stability. Sophie, with quiet fury, makes it clear this was more than a mistake. It was a moral failure. Now, think about how this played out emotionally. Staff described themselves as feeling invisible. Their sacrifices didn't matter. Their loyalty didn't matter. Their voices didn't matter. They weren't just bullied by Meghan. They were erased by the palace. That's what Sophie means when she calls it betrayal. It wasn't only about what Meghan did. It was about what the monarchy allowed to happen. And here's where the story darkens even more. Because betrayal doesn't just break trust in the moment. It lingers. It festers. Sophie says some staff who left during Meghan's era have sworn never to return to royal service. Others carry resentment that will never heal. And that damage isn't just personal, it's institutional. Because the next time the palace faces a crisis, the staff may not trust it to stand by them. The covenant of loyalty has been shattered. But perhaps the most haunting part of Sophie's revelation is how the staff began to view themselves. They no longer saw themselves as servants of history. They saw themselves as expendable pawns. One aide, according to Sophie, put it bluntly: "We gave everything to this institution, and when it mattered, it gave nothing back." Ask yourself this. What does it mean for the monarchy when the very people who hold it together feel betrayed? What does it mean when loyalty, the foundation of the crown, is no longer a two-way street? Sophie says it means danger. Because without loyalty, the monarchy becomes nothing more than a facade. And here's the cliffhanger Sophie leaves us with. The betrayal of the staff wasn't just about Meghan. It wasn't just about screaming matches or resignations. It went all the way to the top. It forced the Queen herself into an impossible position. And the decision she made, to protect the image of the monarchy by sacrificing its people, may be remembered as one of the most painful compromises of her reign.